I'm going to talk about how to migrate to Angular signals. And so, most of you are probably familiar with the idea of signals now and I've heard about them, maybe already using them. And the goal of this talk is really to show you different techniques you can use, different tactics to make it as easy as possible to start using signals at scale in your application. And of course, my goal is to show you that it doesn't have to be very difficult. We can automate some of these steps now as much as possible. And I'll do that on an application so you can see the process on multiple different components and how I change my architecture according to that using signals. So that's the plan. And I think it should take about an hour, probably a little bit less than that. So before I get started, just a few words about myself. My name is Alain. I'm a Google developer expert in Angular and Google Maps. Been working with AngularJS for a very long time, started back in 2011. And I do consulting and training around Angular and web development in general. So I teach Angular, React, JavaScript, TypeScript, testing with Cypress. All of these things fall into the stuff I love to do and I do on a daily basis. I also speak at conferences all around the world and I do talks like this. So online sessions to talk more about Angular and web development. Before I get into our content for today, just a small advertisement piece on the Angular certification. So this is a program that we started back in 2020, and it has become more and more popular. We have, I think by now, thousands of people all around the world who are getting certified. So yeah, feel free to check it out. The website is certificates.dev/Angular. It's a real certification process. It's not easy. It's not just a quiz where you answer questions and you get a certificate. You have to go through live coding. It's challenging. And there's 3 different levels of certification from beginner to advanced senior developer. So yeah, just check it out if you have a minute and you might find something interesting there. So why talking about signals? Because signals started with Angular 16 and now the current version is 19 at the time of this talk. So why are they important? Why do they matter? So the Angular team started with signals with a few different goals in mind. The first one was to help implement reactivity everywhere. So, you're probably familiar, at least to some extent, with RxJS. RxJS is not easy to learn. It requires a learning curve of, learning about observables and subjects and operators, and there's lots of operators. So it's not super easy. And so the Angular team wanted to make it easier for us to implement reactivity using something that's not as tricky as RxJS. And so the Signals API was designed with this in mind, making it easier to implement reactivity in our applications. So Signals are designed to be super lightweight. It's not a big API with tons of different functions and ways to do things. The source code for Signals is about 200 kilobytes of code and super fast. And it's part of Angular, so it's not an extra dependency. It's just something we get with the framework. And precision updates, that's a big deal, and that's something I'm going to illustrate with a diagram next, because that's probably the best part of using signals. It is the improved change detection. So if you use Angular today without trying to optimize anything from a change detection perspective, right? If you just create components and no matter what you do, whether you use RxJS or not, whether you try to optimize, well, there's a few things we can do to tweak change detection, but if you don't do anything by default, no matter how you architect your app, what's going to happen is the following. If somebody interacts with your application, so let's say this is a tree of components that represents our app, and we have a button down here in that component. If someone clicks on that button, it's going to tell Angular something happened, right? We have Zone.js who's in charge of detecting changes, and it's going to say something happened. And so at that point, Angular has to check everything. So Angular is going to go through the main component and then all of the children one by one and just check the entire application if any component got updated and if anything has to be refreshed. And this is triggered by any interaction. A click, an HTTP request that completes, a set timeout that does something. So any browser event, any sort of activity is going to trigger that change detection, which works really well, right? We've been using Angular for years. Some very big applications use Angular and they don't have any problem with that. But now think about this. If instead we had a way that when data changes, Angular knows exactly which component depends on it and which view, which template has to be updated as a result of that data update. That would be ideal, right? Because then it's not even change detection anymore. The framework just knows what to update when the data changes. And that's exactly what happens when we use signals. When we use signals, the framework knows exactly where it is used, what are the dependencies, and which pieces of our app have to be refreshed as a result when we change the value. So in a sense, it's exactly the opposite as what we have right now in terms of change detection, because change detection right now is just blind, doesn't really know what's going on, and just has to check everything all the time. Whereas if you use signals to manage your data, then your application automatically knows exactly what needs to be refreshed when a piece of information changes. So it's a lot more powerful, a lot more precise. And as you can imagine, if you have a big application that does lots of things, this is going to be so much faster. So that's really the reason why, right? If we have to summarize this to just two main points, the reason why Angular decided to go all in with signals is make Zone.js optional. So get rid of that, change detection at the application level and remove the dependency on Zone.js. Have that local change detection, which is really, super precise, super pinpointed. Angular knows exactly what to update. It's also about simplifying Angular's API. So by that, we really mean getting rid of RxJS or hiding it as much as possible. So we don't have to subscribe to observables or deal with all of these callbacks and operators and all of that stuff. And so that's where Angular is right now. The Angular team is really working on the simplification of the APIs, removing RxJS and using signals instead, and evolving, evolving everything, the entire ecosystem as a result. So this means all of the APIs of the framework are slowly moving to be either Signal compatible or just become converted to using Signals. So yeah, I think that was important to mention this as an intro. So yeah, you're aware of it. It's not just a new trend. It's not just a new nice to have. It's really a massive change in terms of how the framework can operate, right? So that's why it's a very big deal to adopt Signals, and there's really a lot of very good implications out of it. Performance, simpler architecture, and basically easier to onboard new developers in your app as well, because the learning curve is a lot easier. So if we want to start using Signals, how do we do that? That's our next step, how to migrate to Signals. And if you have any questions, by the way, you can use the chat if you want. You can post questions in the chat and I'll answer them as I see them pop up here. So I always have an eye on the chat. So yeah, feel free to interact with questions there if you have stuff you want to ask about. And I'll try to answer as many as possible during the session. So we know Signals are important. We know they're the future of Angular, and the Angular team is architecting a lot of things to really make it easier for us to migrate to Signals. So let's start taking a look at those new APIs, new features, and how we can use them. So the concept I want to talk about is the notion of signal-based components, which is really the ultimate goal of the Angular team, is to get to a point where we can use components without Zone.js and even without RxJS, which means right now in Angular 19, you can create components like this, where the inputs are a signal, the outputs are a signal, and we even have this model function, which is now a two-way data binding, which works both as an input and an output. And we'll see all of these with examples. So here's an example for input. So input is a function that is a replacement of the @input decorator. You can use it in a few different ways. So you can declare that input with the type that you expect. So here, input of type string. If you don't give a default value, then the real type is string or undefined. That's option number one. Option number two is to have an input that is required. So input.required of type string. And then the compiler is going to enforce that we pass a value to that input. So it's going to be of type string. And you can also have a default value. So the third example here is an input with a value of 0, which makes it of type number automatically. And yeah, it would have a default value of 0. So I can use these input functions instead of regular inputs. So let's do it. Let's go to my application here. I'm going to start my ng-serve in here, ng-serve. We're going to run this application. I'm going to show you what it looks like, and then we can start migrating to using signals all over the place, pretty much, and yeah, make everything a lot more signal friendly. So, okay, my app is on localhost 4200. That's what it looks like. It's a basic license plate store with multiple different pages and different features associated to it. The first component, the easiest components to migrate to signals at this point are your presentation components. The presentation components are the ones that rely only on inputs and outputs to do something. So in my case, I have this Jumbotron component that's using two inputs, title and description. These are the ones you would see here. So this is the Jumbotron component. This is the big area here with a title and a description. So this, if I want to migrate it to using signals, I can just do that. And in here, I'm going to say, so I remove the old decorator and I'm going to use the new input function instead. So equals input. If my computer wants to do it, there you go. So we import input from Angular core. We specify that it's going to be an input of type string. And now I'm using a signal input. And I can apply the same idea to my second input. So I get rid of the old decorator. I use an input instead, and I can remove the import for the old input. And now I should be all good to go. Now, if I just do this, so if I just remove my decorator, use the new input function, does it work? I go to my app, and you see that it's not quite working. Instead, it's showing the following: input signal, welcome to our store, input signal, browse our collection of license plates. So this is a nice thing that the Angular team added. If we forget to read the value of a signal, it's going to display that in the template that we're displaying the signal itself instead of its value. So I know that I'm not reading the value of my signal properly now. So that's better than, you know, a big error message or anything. It's visual enough. I can realize, oh, I need to read that value now. So we made the change here, and now we have to change our template so we can read the value from a signal, which is done by calling the function like so. So we call the signal as a function. That's how we read the value. So I do that for title, I do that for description, and now everything is back on track. So I just migrated one component to be fully signal based, because it only requires signals here. It's using two input signals, and it's using them in its template. So that's the easiest way we can start. The easiest way we can start migrating stuff. Now, of course, I just did this manually, but I have good news for you. We can automate this at scale, because if we go to the Angular documentation and I open the search tool and I look for migration, come on, show here, migration, manual migration. I somehow always struggle to find this one, but it is somewhere. Creating libraries, no. Angular CLI, schematics. So there is a section somewhere in the documentation where they show us, there we go. So if I go to reference, migrations, now it shows me all of the different migrations I can run. And if I scroll down on that web page, I see that there's a migration for the new input API. So what I just did manually, I could instead use this command to migrate to signal inputs. So ng generate Angular core signal input migration. And that way, it's automatic. I don't need to do anything manually. So I'll give this a try. I'll copy that command, and I'll show you. I have another component here, for instance, that has two inputs and probably more. So let's run the migration command and see what happens. So going to the right folder, just pasting that command here and running it. And so the command is asking me which directory do you want to migrate? Current directory? Yep, I'm in the right folder. So I'll go ahead with that. Do you want to migrate as much as possible, even if it may break your build? Yes, sure. I trust the Angular CLI. So let's do that. So it's looking at the config of the app, it's scanning the inputs, it's going through our components, and it found 2 inputs to migrate. So the nice thing is that it tells us what it did, migrated 2 out of 2 inputs, and basically it was in our license plate component TS. So now if I go to that license plate component TS, you see that, yeah, it made these inputs required automatically using the new function. And then in the template, it's reading the values from those signals. So all of that was done automatically thanks to that command. So if you want to start migrating at scale, you can use those migrations. So migration to single inputs is one option. And of course, there's more, but that's at least some way to get started and apply changes to dozens of different components in one single command. So I see there's a lot of questions that popped up in the chat. So let me cover some of these now. And I'll try to do that in an order that makes sense. So I see questions about RxJS. So I'll cover this when I migrate something with RxJS in a few minutes. If I start using signals, I will not need to do zoneless or to improve the performance of my application. Yeah, if you start using signals everywhere, basically your app doesn't really need Zone.js anymore, and you could remove it. Yes, that's definitely the case. And the Angular team is working on making this even more straightforward. But yeah, if you use signals everywhere, that's really the idea. You don't need Zone.js anymore because the application just knows what to update when you change a signal value. And so this also answers the question on, can a signal detect changes on key properties in nested objects and that kind of stuff? Yes, if you update the object, basically the signal is a way to say something has changed, right? It's an event emitter. So if you change an object using the proper signal update function, whether that you change the entire object or just one key inside that object or inside something nested in it, as long as you use the right mechanism to say, I updated the object, then all of the places that need to re-render as a result of that change are going to re-render, right? So it just by using signals, again, I like to say that when you use signals, it's like if there's no change detection anymore, in a sense, because when you change it, Angular knows exactly which components are impacted already, and it's going to try to re-render those components or the views, so the pieces of template of those components that depend on those signals. So it doesn't matter the scope of the change, because Angular is just going to try to render those components anyways, yeah. And I'll cover one more of these questions. So are signals a replacement for observables? Yes, that's the main goal. It was officially mentioned by the Angular team a few months ago that the idea in the long run is you could use Angular without RxJS and without Zone.js. So you could get rid of these two and still have Angular run using signals for everything. So it's not 100% there yet, but in the long run, maybe by the end of this year or the next one, we should be in a place where everything is, signal based, I think. Yeah. So we saw how to migrate our inputs. We can also migrate outputs. Now, when we migrate outputs to the new output function, it's not using signals, but at least it's removing RxJS, because the current event emitter that we use in an output is actually unobservable. So the idea of replacing those outputs is just to get rid of the dependency on RxJS. So that just shows us that it's not just about signals, it's really about removing RxJS. And the new output function is really all about that. So I'm going to migrate this as well in my app. So I go to the migration documentation. I want to migrate my outputs. I copy the command. I can go to my code, open a terminal here, and run the migration command, which is going to ask me a few questions. Which directory do you want to migrate? I want to migrate everything. So I just take the source folder. I run that command, and it's going to do it. And I only have one output. So it got migrated, and it was in license plate component. So you can see that now my button clicked is an output of license plate, and yeah, it just did it automatically. So just by using these commands, you can start really applying signals all over the place, and yeah, prepare your code for a mode where RxJS is not going to be there anymore. So on top of inputs and outputs, we have model. So model is a two-way binding with signals. I'll show you a quick example here. And I don't have any of these in my app just yet, because it didn't exist before. So there was no such two-way data binding in the past. Not based on inputs and outputs like so, at least. So see here we have this component where we use a two-way data binding for first name, a two-way data binding for age. And these two things, if we go to the name entry component, you see that they are declared with a model. So first name is a model, age is a model. And so here I can change the value of first name or age from this child component, and the values are displayed in the parent component. So the parent component is the one reading the signals name and age. And so if I click the buttons here to increase the age or change the first name, you can see that it's working. So I'm using these commands to update my signals in the child component, and the updates are rendered in the parent automatically thanks to these models. So it makes it a lot easier to have a two-way binding, a two-way communication. Doesn't require the forms module, doesn't require ng model anymore. So it means no additional imports to make that happen too. We just use that model function and we're good to go. And I'll put that example in the chat. So if you want to take a look at that StackBlitz, you'll be able to do that. So we saw input, new outputs, new model. On top of that, so there is the equivalent, to migrate view child, content child, view children, content children. So there's same thing. All of these older decorators can now be used as signals, signal-based equivalents with functions. And then, it's a signal that emits a value and you can react to this. And so, yeah, all of these base APIs are already available in that mode. We can just use them right now. Some are still in developer preview. That's the case for model. Well, yeah, inputs, outputs, I'm not even sure they're in dev preview anymore. I can double check on the website. I think those are stable now. Let's check input. Yeah, it's stable. There's no more developer preview flag here. So I can actually remove that. It's not true anymore, it became stable. The only thing that remains in dev preview in the signals API is the effect function that can still maybe change in the future. Now, if I want to migrate from RxJS to signals, the next thing we need to do is replacing RxJS calls, RxJS observables with signals. And so we have a bunch of utilities to do that. One function is toSignal. So if I use toSignal on an observable like this, then I just get a signal out of it. And I can read that data using a signal instead of having to subscribe to that observable. So yeah, I see a lot of questions in the chat about, hey, can we still use RxJS? How do we subscribe? Well, that's one way you can interact, right? Now I can just get my observable and turn it into a signal. So the observable is still here. I could still apply operators to it if I needed to. So if you're already using operators in a specific way and you want to keep that, you can. It's just that at the final step, before getting the data, instead of consuming that data as an observable, which requires subscription, unsubscription, and adds more code, you can just convert it to a signal like so. That would be the idea. Now, some of you mentioned that in the comments, is that RxJS and observables are a little bit different from signals in the fact that signals are synchronous and always have a value, whereas when we use observables, most of them are asynchronous and don't have a value immediately, right? So one of the ways to use a signal where we have an observable is to use the toSignal conversion function. But then in order to deal with the fact that we're gonna get the value later on, so if we don't want to have to deal with undefined values temporarily, we can pass an initial value to our signal. And that way, it's always going to have a value. We don't need to worry about initially getting undefined and then getting a value from that signal. And that's again because an RxJS observable is asynchronous. So initially there's no data, it might take a few milliseconds to get that data. So here in the meantime, we provide a meaningful default value. So now that we know about this, I have a piece of logic in my application, which is a currency service, and it's all based on RxJS. So it has a behavior subject. It's using the HTTP client, which returns observables. So it's using operators as well with latest from and map. So it's using lots of RxJS stuff. And what I want to do next is replace this with signals. And this is going to answer all of the questions that you have and that I haven't answered yet. I didn't enter them on purpose because I knew you would see that in action right now. So I'll show you the feature that I'm about to change in action. So this application displays prices. These prices are in US dollar by default. And what I want to do is be able to go here and change the currency to euro or to British pounds. And when I change the value, you see that all of the prices, they got updated. The price is different, the symbol is different, and we applied an exchange rate to all of these prices, right? So as I click here, select a different value, all of that is reactive, all of that gets updated. In my current state of things, all of this is done with these behavior subjects and observable of exchange rate and all of that stuff. So I have a behavior subject that stores the current currency. So when I change the value in the dropdown, this subject is going to get updated. I have an HTTP request that gets the exchange rates from a server. That's also an observable. And then I combine these two things using a current rate observable, where we just, combine the two sources. What's the current currency? What are the exchange rates? To return and map to just return the exchange rate for the current currency. And then I just have getters and setters to expose these observables, which my components have to subscribe to. So if that's, for instance, my license plate component, it's getting the currency, subscribing to it with the async pipe, getting the exchange rate, subscribing to it with the async pipe, and then displaying the prices and formatting that currency. So it's all RxJS based, and my goal is to migrate this to signals in a way that's as straightforward as possible. So let's get started. So I'm going to break everything, basically, for a few minutes, and then it should be all back to stable and no more operators or anything like this. And I think we are going to end up with less code in the end. So first, behavior subject. How do I translate this into a signal? Well, easy enough. I can just say that I'm going to use a signal that is of type currency and has a default value of USD. So this signal that stores USD is going to replace the behavior subject that we have here. So that's the easiest translation I can think of, right? A behavior subject with a default value gets turned into a signal with a default value. Okay, that's done. Now, the exchange rates observable. How do I turn this one into a signal? So I could do something similar. Now I'm going to call this exchange rates. So it's still going to make that HTTP request, but since I don't want to work with RxJS, or at least minimize how much we work with RxJS, I'm going to use the toSignal function here around that code. So that would be the equivalent. And if I don't want to have to deal with undefined, what I can do is pass a second parameter to that toSignal function to provide an initial value, which I'm going to do here. So by default, if we don't have any exchange rates, I'm just going to use 1 for everything, GBP 1, and that way I'm covered. I have default values, and I basically, so what we do is we kind of hide the fact that this request is asynchronous because we have a default value that's going to be set initially, and once we get the real data, we replace the initial value. So that's my signals for exchange rates. And I keep the old ones just so you can see them. Maybe I'll comment them out. So I comment out the RxJS code and I leave the new signal-based code instead. And so now my current rate observable is going to be a current rate signal. And that's one of my favorite parts of the Signals API, is that to replace all of the operators from RxJS, we can basically rely on one thing, and that one thing is computed. So computed is a function that creates a new signal to compute a value out of other signals. So in my case, we are going to get the exchange rates from the exchange rate signals. We're going to get the currency out of my currency signal. So this dot currency, and then I want to return a combined value like so. So very similar to what I did before here, but no need to map, no need to do with latest from. This is automatically going to happen just by reading the values in that computed and then returning my combination of the values here. And so yeah, now I can remove this and I have migrated everything to using signals. So what I can do is really replace observable with a signal here. So current rate. Oh, this is current rate, not current signal. This is now a signal of currency. This dot currency, I can make it as read only. So the equivalent of as observable on a subject would be as read only on a signal, to make sure we cannot change it that easily. And the next method on a subject becomes a set call on a signal. And now my service is migrated. So it's only exposing and interacting with signals. The only piece of RxJS left is the one that there's no other options right now, really. That's the HTTP client making a GET request. But I kind of hide it under the hood by using toSignal instead. So yeah, I see a question, how to handle exceptions and such. In this scenario, so remember that RxJS is still here. So I could use the pipe function here, and I could do a catch error if I wanted to. That's still possible. So that could be a way to do it. And catching the error would maybe emit, something different to that signal, or display a toaster, or some sort of error message. So again, RxJS is still here. We still have that one observable. So we can still apply operators to deal with formatting or exceptions, or that sort of thing. So now if I wanted this to be complete, I would go to my currency switcher component. So I don't need to subscribe to things anymore. I can just get the currency signal from my service, display the current value, and then in my license plate component, same thing. It's going to simplify quite a bit. So we get currency, we get the exchange rate from our service, and in the template, well, now we can really simplify quite a bit, because there's no more async pipe, no more having to deal with default values or anything. So I can just remove all of this, and here divide by exchange rates and read the value of currency like this. So remove quite a bit of code. I can get rid of the import of the async pipe as well. And so, yeah, the main benefits of this is, there's no more subscription and subscription. It just happens. Did I break everything or does it still work? Let's see. I change the currency and the currencies get updated. So yeah, all looks good. So yeah, that's a conversion to using signals. And yeah, I can get rid of all of the RxJS dependencies now. And I think, from my perspective, the code is easier to read. Computed can replace dozens of RxJS operators, really. It's pretty nice. And yeah, I think we gain in readability. And so yeah, I'll share that code after the presentation, so you can take a look at it and use it. Yeah. And so yeah, this application is not very big, but now it's migrated to using signals. Now, if we have something bigger and more possible things to do. So there's new options now with Angular 19. There's a new feature that was released, which I think is one of the main interesting things to consider for Angular in the future, and that's the resource API. So I'm bringing this here, the resource API. So the idea of the resource API, now I want to note it's still experimental. It's still very new. It's not stable yet. So don't use it in production. I'll put the link to that post here so you can see the example. But the idea of a resource is that it's a way to make it even easier to integrate signals in our apps and comes with extra benefits. For instance, a lot of you asked about how do we deal with errors? How do we know if we're loading or not? And when you use a resource, you have all of that built in. So to use a resource, there is a function like this one, Rx resource. We pass a loader to it, which is how do we get the data? So that's where we have our RxJS observable. So the loader is the HTTP request in that scenario. And once we have defined that loader for the resource, we get an API that's pretty interesting because we can define triggers for that request. So I can add another signal here called page config, which is going to trigger the request to run with specific parameters. So this example is a pagination. Like you have an array of data and you can go from page 1, page 2, page 3 and navigate back and forth. So the current page is a signal. The size of the page is also a signal. I combine these two signals into one using computed. And I use that new page config signal as the source, as the trigger for my request. And so every time we change the page number or the page size, it's going to trigger the request and make that loader run the request again. No operators needed, no switch map or whatever. If a signal changes, the HTTP request runs again and acts as a trigger, which can be a combination of multiple different signals, as I've done here. Now, on top of that, we get extra benefits with the API, like it has a reload method. So if I want to do a refresh of the data, I can call resource.reload to make that refresh happen. I can also easily define a loader and have an alternative template because there is a isLoading method on the resource to know when the request is actually running in the background. So resource isLoading. And there's also a resource error. So you can also check if there's an error and display a specific message when things go wrong. So you can handle everything without operators, without, the only RxJS thing that remain is really the call to the HTTP client, right? And everything else is now signals. So is loading is a signal, as error is a signal, getting the value of our resource is also a signal. So the resource just captures everything in one place. And so this link that I gave you has a link to the example. I'll share this one quickly. Put the link in the chat. Resource example. So I have multiple different signals. I combine them with computed. Then I have my resource with the page config. And so all we do when we navigate from one page to the next is update our signal. So that's a setup around our code. And now you see that we have multiple pages. I click and you see the loader showing up, the spinner, as I click around and navigate from one page to the next. If I change the page size, it's gonna make another request. It's also super fast and it's all reactive. And basically the entire code to achieve this is just setting up that resource and the triggers using signals. So it's really as concise as possible, as tiny as possible, and makes it really pretty interesting. So again, this is in developer preview, so not ready for production yet, but something to consider, something to keep in mind for the future, and basically, I suggest trying to play around with it and maybe prototype things around that because it's really powerful. So, what's next for signals? The future of signals is now a little bit clearer because the Angular team published the strategy for 2025 a few days ago, 10 days ago. And some of the priorities, two of the main priorities are promoting zoneless to developer preview. And the next big things for forms is going to be signal forms. So instead of having to use RxJS with, reactive forms, we'll have a new option called signal forms where everything is signals. So that's one of the big projects for 2025. So yeah, the Angular team is all in on signals, keeps going and migrating everything to use signals everywhere. The resource API is one of the most recent things that I think is really exciting and that we can start adopting, or at least we can start testing a little bit. Now I'll cover some of the questions. So I put that slide here with all of the links. The recording of this session is going to be on YouTube. So you can already subscribe to youtube.com Angular training to access the recording there. I have a link to my blog, email address if you want to reach out with questions. The free weekly Angular newsletter that I publish every week sends a few updates about Angular and a reminder about the certification exams. So all of this is here. And now I'm going to answer questions from the chat, and there's a lot of them. So I'll try to cover as many as possible from what I see here. I've been updating my production app to signals for a while. My habit has been to stick with observer in services, use to signal to create a signal in my components. Is this the way to go until resource is out of preview? I would do it. What I do is like I did here. So I do the to signal conversion inside the service itself. So my components don't have to know about RxJS. They don't have to even use to signal. And I think it's better that way because you can have signal-driven components already, right? Where everything is a signal, they don't depend on RxJS anymore. So I would convert to signal right from the services and only do RxJS in services. People asked a lot about lifecycle hooks too. Lifecycle hooks are still there. You can still use them. But the thing is, when you think about it, now that we have computed, it's not as useful to have lifecycle hooks, because if I needed to do an ng on changes, for instance, to combine the values of my two inputs here, I could just use computed instead of ng on changes, and it would do the exact same thing. So you can still use lifecycle hooks if you want, but you can also use computed for many of these scenarios, which I think in many cases is actually going to be better because it's just creating another signal, which means it plays well with the new change propagation mechanism. And so I would use computed as much as possible instead of lifecycle hooks. How can we implement operators? So again, you can still use operators if you want. RxJS is still there. There's still an HTTP request that I make no matter what using the HTTP client. So if you want to do a pipe and a debounce or whatever, you can still do that, right? It's not one or the other at this point. You can use both together, right? And make the transition to signals at the last second. But yeah, you can still use everything from RxJS that you want and need, and then convert your observable into a signal. Which is a nice thing because you're not losing anything as a result. You can still use whatever you need from RxJS and whatever you need from signals. Another question I see, if we have a list of signals, is it right to implement computed for each? Yeah, most likely. Depends on what you're trying to do and how many signals and what the end result is supposed to be, but this sounds right. You can definitely use computed on many different signals, not just one or two or three. So the recording will be on YouTube with the links to the slides and everything. You can also send me an email if you want to request specific links or stuff. API using resource, we did that. Going through the list of questions. So I think I answered everything on RxJS and operators, right? Bob is asking, can we still buy you coffee? That's a very good question. Yeah, I forgot to mention it, but I do these workshops for free. And if you appreciate the work, if you want more of these, you can support me and this work by buying me a coffee. And there's a link to do so at the bottom of the newsletter website. So here would be the easiest way to buy me a coffee. Oh, and Bob, I see, is one of the last ones to have done it last year. So yeah, if you go to the newsletter website, there's still the link down here to do that. So yeah, if you want to buy me some coffee, feel free to do so. Always happy to get some coffee and support from all of you after these sessions. Yep, and yeah, I'll put the direct link to the page here as well in the chat. Again, you don't have to, but if you appreciate these sessions and want to reward me just a little bit for doing it, that's an easy way to do so. So yeah, I think we've been through everything in the Q&A. Again, you can reach out on LinkedIn, by email, on the blog, any way you want. Always happy to answer questions. So Thanks everyone for attending. I think it was one of the most successful sessions. We had over 80 participants at some point. So thanks everyone for coming today. I know you're all around the world, so for some of you, it must be late in the night or in the evening. So yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for all the questions. And we'll be in touch next month for the next monthly workshop. And in the meantime, you can find the recording very soon on YouTube as well. So again, thanks everyone, and see you next month. Bye.